World War II was a cataclysmic event that changed the course of history, not just for nations, but for individuals. Amid the staggering loss of life, the tireless courage of those who fought on the front lines is often celebrated, but there is a forgotten group whose sacrifices remain largely unrecognized: Soviet women soldiers. These women, often hailed for their bravery during the war, were relegated to the periphery of history after the conflict ended. Their experiences marked by heroism, tragedy, and neglect deserve to be told, not only as a testament to their resilience, but as a reminder of the complex legacies left by the war. When Nazi Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, few could have predicted the scale of the destruction that would follow. The Soviet Union, with its vast territories and an army spread thin, found itself in desperate need of reinforcements. Women, many of them young and untrained, answered the call for help. It was a desperate time, and women were no longer just working behind the scenes as nurses or administrators. They were stepping into the fray, becoming soldiers, snipers, tank drivers, and even combat pilots. The role of women in the Soviet military began to shift dramatically as the war escalated. By the time the Germans launched their invasion, millions of men had been sent to the front lines, and the Soviet Union was in desperate need of troops to bolster its defenses. Women, who had traditionally been excluded from combat roles, now found themselves not only involved in the war effort, but also fighting side by side with men. The Soviet government, initially reluctant, came to recognize the need for their participation, and the number of women in combat roles began to rise. Women's contributions to the war effort were as varied as they were significant. Thousands of women served in non-combat roles, working in factories, collecting supplies, and caring for the wounded. But the real revolution came when they began to join combat units. Women joined infantry divisions, served as machine gunners, and became part of the increasingly popular all-female battalions. Their presence was not just a necessity but a symbol of Soviet resilience. The conditions on the front lines were grueling for all soldiers, but for women, the challenges were compounded by gender prejudice and the horror of war. Soviet women soldiers, many of whom had no prior military training, faced a brutal initiation. They were thrust into battle with little preparation, often with outdated equipment and inadequate supplies. For these women, combat was not only physically demanding but emotionally taxing. The fear and chaos of battle, the constant threat of death or injury, and the realization that they might never return home were ever present. Despite these overwhelming odds, many women proved themselves to be some of the most skilled and determined fighters in the Soviet military. Some became snipers, celebrated for their precision and skill. Others served as pilots in the famous all-female 588th Night Bomber Regiment, known as the Night Witches, whose daring night raids on Nazi positions became legendary. The stories of these women are filled with incredible acts of bravery. One such story is that of Yevdokia Zavali, a sniper who, despite being wounded, continued to fight until she was captured. The story, like so many others, reveals a profound commitment to the Soviet cause and a deep sense of duty. Women like Zavali were not just fighting for their country, they were fighting for survival, for their comrades, and for the future of their families. As soldiers, they faced not just the enemy, but a pervasive sense of gendered prejudice. In many cases, the male soldiers of the Soviet army were less than welcoming to their female counterparts. The stereotype of women as weak or incapable of handling the harshness of war was pervasive, and many women soldiers had to prove themselves time and time again. Despite the resentment from some male comrades, these women soldiers pushed on, showing incredible resilience. The terror of war for Soviet women soldiers did not end with the Russian front lines. If captured by the Nazis, women faced brutal treatment that was beyond the horrors of war. Many were executed, tortured, or sent to concentration camps where their fates were often as tragic as those of their male counterparts. However, what set them apart was the specific cruelty reserved for them due to their gender. Female prisoners were often subjected to sexual violence, and their executions were marked by a viciousness meant to humiliate and degrade. For the Nazis, capturing a female Soviet soldier was not just a military victory, it was an opportunity for additional psychological warfare. They saw women in the Soviet army as traitors to their gender, an affront to the traditional patriarchal values that guided Nazi ideology. Female prisoners were often treated as worse than their male counterparts. Many were forced to march to their deaths in humiliating conditions. Others were sent to labor camps, while some met their end in mass executions. One such case is that of the female soldiers of the 107th Rifle Division, who fought valiantly at the Battle of Stalingrad. These women fought side by side with their male comrades, but upon capture by the Germans, they were executed. Some were publicly humiliated, paraded before the enemy to show what was considered the Soviet weakness. The cruelty of the Nazi regime toward women soldiers highlights the brutality of war and the gendered violence women faced. But not all women were executed. Some were sent to concentration camps, where they were forced to endure extreme hardship. They lived in squalid conditions, worked until they collapsed, and often died from starvation or disease. Yet some survived these camps, emerging as living testaments to the indomitable strength of the human spirit. Despite their heroism on the front lines, Soviet women soldiers faced a bitter reality after the war. While their male counterparts were hailed as heroes, many women were left to struggle with post-war neglect. The Soviet government, which had initially been supportive of women's involvement in the military, turned its back on them once the war ended. There was little recognition for their sacrifices, and they were often ostracized or forgotten. After the war, women soldiers were rarely honored. The Soviet regime, which was more than willing to utilize women during the war, had little interest in elevating their status once peace was restored. In many cases, the women were denied the same benefits that male soldiers received, such as pensions or medals. Instead of being celebrated as heroes, they were pushed back into traditional gender roles. Many were expected to return to their homes and raise families, as if their wartime contributions had never occurred. The case of women like Yevdokia Zavely is emblematic of the broader neglect faced by Soviet women soldiers after the war. Zavely, who had fought valiantly and been wounded during the war, found herself marginalized and forgotten. Despite her heroic service, she received little recognition for her efforts. Her story was lost to history, as were the stories of so many other women who fought bravely but were neglected by the very state they had fought to protect. While some women, like the Night Witches of the 588th Regiment, were eventually recognized for their courage, the broader group of Soviet women soldiers remained largely invisible in the historical record. It wasn't until decades later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that their contributions began to receive the attention they deserved. The legacy of Soviet women soldiers is one of resilience and strength. Despite the horrors they faced on the battlefield and the prejudice they encountered within their own ranks, these women showed the world that courage knows no gender. Their sacrifices were monumental, their bravery unparalleled. They fought not just for their country, but for the future of their families, their communities, and their nation. But their story does not end with the war. The story of Soviet women soldiers is also a story of the marginalization of women in the aftermath of conflict. Their contributions were overshadowed by the male-dominated narratives of heroism that often define war. Yet, as history moves forward, the voices of these women are being heard again. Their stories are beginning to be acknowledged, not as isolated tales of individual bravery, but as part of the larger narrative of World War II, a narrative that includes both men and women, both soldiers and civilians, all of whom played a vital role in the ultimate defeat of fascism. These women, whose names were once lost to history, now stand as symbols of courage, determination, and sacrifice. Their stories remind us of the complex and often painful legacies of war. They challenge us to remember the forgotten heroes who fought and died, not for recognition, but for the survival of their nation. And in doing so, they ask us to reconsider how we define heroism, not just as a battle won, but as the enduring strength of those who refuse to be forgotten. In the end, the story of Soviet women soldiers is not just a tale of war. It is a story of human strength, resilience, and the relentless fight for equality and recognition. It is a reminder that heroism comes in many forms, and that the forgotten voices of history deserve to be heard. Their bravery is a beacon for future generations, proving that no one, regardless of gender, should ever be overlooked in the fight for a better world.